Hey guys. Kinda caught me in the middle of a bad time. See, I'm in the middle of some good old-fashioned extermination. Took me a bit, but I think I finally got rid of all the Pong in the house. Wait, there's one now! That's not a good sign. Those things usually breed like rabbits.
The second generation of consoles. After the first generation of game consoles proved the success of home gaming as a market, you'll never guess what was next for home gaming. Unless you know how to count. Quick refresher, the first generation of consoles were all incredibly simple machines that all served the purpose of bringing video games, which at the time were relegated to either arcades or computers, into the home, and each had varying degrees of success. There was the Magnavox Odyssey, the Atari Home Pong, the Coleco Telstar line of systems, and the Color TV game line of systems. That's right, 4 different companies, 4 different lines of systems, and they all had one game to share between them. This was the era of the Pong system, systems designed to play Pong and not much else.
Man, I was hoping they'd tuck me in at least.
Yeah, Pong was a good time in the 70s, but after the 3000th game, it starts to get a little stale. That's when all these companies, and some market newcomers, decided to usher in a new age of video game systems. The second generation of consoles lasted from 1976 and ended with the video game crash of 1983, which famously almost killed the entire medium here in the West. So my hopes aren't very high. But you all know the drill by now. We're going to take a look at each of these consoles and see how they hold up in the 21st century. I still haven't heard back from any of my job applications, so I got nothing better to do. There were 6 major consoles released in this era, but there were far more than 6 on the market. I'm narrowing it down to these systems because most of the hardware released during this time didn't last very long and didn't leave much of an impression. So I'm sticking to the more notable ones.
We're going to tackle these in release order, because I will do anything to avoid talking about Atari. First up is... what?
This is the Fairchild Channel F. Don't know what it is? I don't need to be self-conscious, nobody does. The Channel F was created by the company Fairchild Camera and Instrument, a company that got its start with military-grade aerial cameras. I don't know what the deal is with these early game companies having ties with the US military, but I have the sudden urge to buy the latest Call of Duty. The Channel F was released in 1976 and was the first console in this generation. The Fairchild company saw the success of arcade games and Pong machines released a few years prior, and decided to use their success in the tech business to tackle the home video game market. Fairchild was in a unique place to do so as well. They were one of the only companies at the time who already had a hand in video games. Fairchild manufactured microprocessors which were used in computers and even some arcade games, and they used that knowledge to make their own game system. The Channel F is much more notable from a hardware standpoint than a software one. The controller was, let's just say, unique. This looks like you play the games with a detonator. In actuality, the controller works like a standard joystick. You hold it upright and move the top stick around to control games. I don't know one myself because I'm not paying this much for anything, but I have held one at my local game store and, yeah, this thing looks like a plastic Snickers bar, but it feels solid enough to control games with. But this isn't the hardware I was talking about. The Channel F is notable for being the very first video game device with interchangeable cartridges. I don't think it can be overstated what a big deal this was. Before this, all video game based hardware, aside from computers, had to have the games built into it. Arcade games, consoles, you pretty much had to tailor make the games for the hardware itself, as there was absolutely no way you were going to change the game. If you were buying Coleco Telstar Quick Draw, you could only play Quick Draw. I thought this was America. But this changed everything. Every advancement in home console gaming can be traced back to this moment, and we have one Jerry Lawson to thank for it. Jerry Lawson was the unsung hero of home console gaming. Lawson was an engineer for the Fairchild company, and he was responsible for a lot of the technology used in the Channel F, including the interchangeable cartridges. Without him, we would never have this innovation, and without it, we wouldn't get legendary consoles later down the line. The NES, SNES, Sega Genesis, Saturn, Game Boy Advance DS, they can all trace their roots back to Jerry Lawson and the Fairchild Channel F. That is incredible. That completely justifies this thing's existence, and the games themselves. I mean, they all effing stink, but hey! Cartridges! In all seriousness, this was the first home console to come after the era of the Pong system. So did you really expect anything major with this thing? There were only 22 games released for the Channel F, and they were all stupidly simple, used this white background, and were mostly educational titles meant for really young kids. And the ones that weren't were just more fucking Pong! Does that mean there's no value to be had here? Yes, but again, the fact that it had interchangeable cartridges was such a huge leap forward for console gaming that I can't discount it entirely. The Channel F did see one hardware revision, the System 2, but it was mainly just to lower the price. All in all, the Channel F got discontinued in 1983, so it did manage to live a decently long life, but the fact that nobody talks about this thing is proof that it wasn't exactly a notable one. Still, I'll always commend it for being the first system with a noticeable technological improvement. God bless you, Jerry Lawson. Godspeed. Next up we have the Atari 2600. Listen, I've made my feelings about Atari products well known by this point, but I'm willing to swallow my pride for a second here and try to be fair to this thing.
It gave me heartburn.
The successor to the Atari Home Pong, the 2600, or the VCS, short for Video Computer System, is probably what a lot of people think of when they think of the first console ever. While it obviously wasn't, what the hell else did I talk about for 10 minutes? It was, however, the first big success story in console gaming. The 2600 was a pretty big leap for gaming in terms of the power of the hardware. Now you may be looking at the footage on screen and saying, dude, come on, what power? And you'd be right to say that, but keep in mind, this thing released in 1977, not long after the first console generation. And while those systems could pretty much only display 2 dots in a line, look at this! That's at least 4 whole lines on the screen, holy shit! The 2600 wasn't exactly a graphical powerhouse, but it was much more capable of displaying graphics than anything that had come before it. Because of this, the 2600 became a runaway success. There were way more games produced for this thing than for any other console at the time. Sure, the Channel F may have had 22 games, but Atari had over 400 titles from its conception to its discontinuation in 1992. Like, god damn, I know people who I went to high school with who had way less games released for them. This success was due to a number of reasons, namely Atari's mainstream appeal due to them being a pretty big arcade developer, their marketing pushing how this system could let you play their arcade games in the home, and the sheer amount of games that released for it. They kept everything really simple too. The system itself was pretty much just plug and play. You put a cartridge in, turn it on, bam, just wasted 30 bucks. The controller was simple to understand too, and with a much better design than the Channel F's controller. You have one joystick, capable of moving in 8 directions, and only one button. Sure, that limited developers in terms of game controls, but it made it so that each game's controls were incredibly easy to understand. And the game library? Adventure, Asteroids, Yar's Revenge, Pitfall, Missile Command, Combat, River Raid, Ice Hockey. Sure, these games all look stupidly simple nowadays, but compare that to 4 systems that could literally only play Pong. Yet no wonder this thing did as well as it did. Now, the problems with the 2600 start to form when you try to judge it by today's standards. I have made it abundantly clear that as someone who grew up in the early 2000s whose first game system was a Super Nintendo, going back to games as simple as my own personal kryptonite. But even I can have some fun with games like Yar's Revenge. That one's actually pretty fun. At the end of the day, while I don't see much of a reason to play many of these games today, I can't discredit the reputation the 2600 has. It's by far the most successful system of this time, and looking back on the library, the controller, and the brand recognition, it's incredibly easy to see why.
Well, I said something positive about Atari, and when you look at that, the world didn't end. Let's hope I never have to do that again. The next system we're taking a look at is the Magnavox Odyssey 2. Can I go back to talking about Atari?
Okay, this one's gonna be really quick. The Magnavox Odyssey 2. Surely after seeing how lame the original Odyssey was, people were asking, where's the Odyssey 2? Who the fuck said that? Obviously, the original Odyssey was a decent enough success for Magnavox to want to take another crack at it. It was the first home console ever created. Despite how simple and underwhelming it was, it inspired this whole console gaming thing in the first place. And Magnavox knew how lucrative this business would become. They'd be stupid not to make a successor. Well, joke's on them because they made the Odyssey 2. Okay, it sounds like I'm being harsh here, but really, the Odyssey 2 was a huge step up from its predecessor. The original Odyssey was by far the least powerful system of that generation. Now, of course, when you have an entire generation of systems that can only play Pong, who cares about power? But at least a color TV game could display in color. It's in the fucking name. But Magnavox put 6 years of hardware advancements to good use. The system's pretty much on par with the 2600 graphics wise, but just comparing the leap between those systems and their predecessors, it's honestly impressive how the Odyssey 2 was able to hold up to the competition. The controller was a little weird looking, but hey, it still kept the same philosophy as the 2600's joystick. Hell, the Odyssey 2 even came with a keyboard. It was mostly used for educational titles, but there was also software that you could buy that acted as an introduction to programming. This thing was ahead of its time in many ways. But why does nobody talk about it? Well, if you want to know the reason why, we just talked about it. The 2600 dominated the console market this generation, and because of that, it had a stranglehold on third-party developers. Throughout most of its life, the Odyssey 2 was pretty much only supplied by games made by Magnavox themselves. And while there were some quality games released for it, it just didn't have the sheer numbers that the 2600 did. First off, there were only 53 titles released for this thing in North America, compared to the 2600's 400 plus. Secondly, Atari was a game company with a long history in arcade games. Magnavox was an electronics company mostly known for radios, TV sets, and military defense technology. If you needed ballistic missiles, they were your guy, but in the home gaming space, they just couldn't measure up to Atari. Though I will say the Odyssey 2's box art looked pretty sick. The Odyssey 2 was a decent success, selling over 2 million units by the time it was all said and done. It just didn't stand a chance against the titan that was Atari. Well, the Odyssey 2 struggled against Atari, but there was another company that wound up being another nail in the coffin for Magnavox. That wound up being the Mattel Intellivision. Yeah, the guys that made Barbie and Hot Wheels, give them Donkey Kong. Released in 1979, the Intellivision was the game system that every 70s gamer could only dream of. Mattel saw the rise of arcade games and started working on a home console as early as 1969. The fact that they were working on this thing for a decade, and the fact that they were able to learn from the mistakes of the systems of the previous generation, meant that when this thing finally came out, it was pretty damn cutting edge as far as the 70s were concerned. The graphics and sound capabilities were leagues ahead of what the 2600 could do. Nothing you look at now and go, "Holy shit!" But it's still much better than its predecessors. The controller was strange. I don't know what happened here, but I imagine some businessman at Mattel looked at his telephone and went, "Yes." The Intellivision controller has 10 face buttons, plus clear and enter buttons numbered like a cell phone. Why? Can't answer that question for you, but my shoulders can't go any higher than this. Because of the unique controller input, most games had an overlay that you could put on the controller so you could tell what each button did, as there wasn't any universal control layout like with modern consoles. There's also this little circle thing. It's weird, but it's good for games like Breakout or any arcade game where you normally use a trackball. But okay, that's enough about the controller. What about the games released for it? The Intellivision was mostly the home of racing games and sports games. Now, I'm a pretty big fan of racing games, but for sports games, we're gonna have to consult our Meegle on the scene once again. Meegle?
Man, football.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and say that I'm not really the target demographic for these games. However, there were a whole heap of arcade ports here, and while they're far from arcade perfect, they are way better than the same games on Atari. Like with the 2600, you had to pretty much take their word for it that you were in fact playing the arcade game. Like, ooh, here's Pac-Man on your 2600. Yeah, whatever you say, Atari. But here, Donkey Kong, Burger Time, Centipede, Dig Dug. Yeah, they look kinda stinky by today's standards, but I will take these any day over the Atari ports. The main problem with the Intellivision was there were so many different versions of it. See, Mattel may have been the ones to create the hardware, but they let damn near anybody license it and slap their own branding onto it. Problem is, there's no guarantee of quality with any of these third-party systems. There was a damn Radio Shack Intellivision. This flooding of the market with hardware would eventually lead to some pretty catastrophic events for gaming as a whole, but it's not something that Mattel themselves were the only culprit of. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Intellivision was a pretty big success, all things considered. Mattel was able to take a lot of market share away from Atari, so much so that it scared Atari enough to make a second system in the same generation. This is the Atari 5200, because someone at Atari really loved multiplying by 2. Released in 1982, this was meant to be the successor to the 2600, being marketed as twice as powerful, therefore twice as fun. You could tell a lot of their design choices were created as a response to the Intellivision. The controller also had a number pad on it, because yeah, that's what was wrong with the 2600, it didn't have enough buttons. The system itself is pretty cool looking. A black box with that sleek silver bar, it's pretty cool. However, I think the 2600 with its wood grain finish does look a bit more iconic. The 5200 is even backwards compatible with 2600 games, which is honestly dope as shit. I'm pretty sure this was the first instance of backwards compatibility in the gaming industry, so that's actually a huge deal for Atari. Now, when it comes to games that you could get on the 5200 itself, there was Choplifter, Berserk, Defender, Dig Dug, Missile Command. Oh. You mean to tell me that you went through the trouble of making a whole ass new console, asked customers to pay $270 for it, and yet the games you released for the thing were the same damn games you released on your previous hardware? And yet, they were better looking and sounding versions of said games, but it doesn't change the fact that at the end of the day, they're still the same damn games! And I know what you're thinking, at least it had backwards compatibility so you could still play your old games on your new hardware. Or I could just use that old hardware. Think about it, if you were someone who was a fan of Atari in 1982, you almost certainly already owned a 2600, so why would you drop nearly $300 on something that had games you could already play on your current system? If you wanted a new piece of hardware with new games to play, why not just get an Intellivision? The 5200 was a complete failure as far as I'm concerned. It didn't measure up to the success of the 2600 at all. It was one of the lowest selling systems of this generation too. It did manage to sell 1 million units, but when the only thing that you've beaten is the Channel F, I think it's safe to say you done fucked up.
I'm not saying the 5200 was complete garbage. I'm saying it was something made by Atari. Not my fault those are synonyms. We got one more system to take a look at, and while I may have the least to say about it, that doesn't mean it's an unworthy system.
Last on our journey through the second console generation, the ColecoVision. Also released in 1982, the ColecoVision was by far the most powerful hardware of its time. While this entire generation was full of systems that promised to bring the arcade experience home, the ColecoVision was the first to ever actually deliver on that promise. Look at Donkey Kong. My god, it's actually Donkey Kong. Because of the graphical capabilities, Coleco saw a whole heap of third-party support, from Nintendo to Sega, and the games released for it were seen as some of the best ever at the time. This system showed what video games in the home could truly be. It also had a number pad controller, so clearly the disease was spreading. It even had an accessory that lets you play 2600 cartridges. I'm sure if this thing was more successful, we'd all understand the benefits of crossbreeding by now. But why wasn't it more successful? The ColecoVision was the third highest selling system of this era, selling 2 million units, which is right behind Intellivision's 3 million and Atari's 30 million with the 2600. It's not a bad number at all, but for the most powerful system in this era, that's a bit disappointing. So, what happened? Well, this is where the gaming market starts to take a turn for the worse. You see, Atari's success may have been partially due to the sheer amount of games released for it, but therein lies the problem. There were just too many games on the market. Plus, I may have just talked about the 6 most notable consoles, but like I said, there were 13 total. And this was still in the infancy of home gaming being a thing. Consumers didn't know what games could be played on what system and which systems were worth buying, and it just became too much for the average person to keep up with. Plus, at least on the 2600, there was absolutely no quality control. Atari didn't care who released games on their system, and because of that, the market became bloated with trash games and games that left many consumers feeling burned by their purchases. This all culminated with the 1982 release of E.T. There were plenty of movie tie-in games for the 2600, and E.T. was set to be a huge hit for the system. They marketed this thing like crazy, had official strategy guides made for it, created hundreds of thousands of copies. There were some rumors that they made more copies of this game than there were Atari consoles on the market. Then the game came out and everything went to shit. Why? The game came out. E.T. was seen as one of the absolute worst games of all time. It was a buggy, confusing mess, even with a guide. Customers who bought it immediately returned it. Many were so disappointed they swore off video games as a whole. This led to the video game crash of 1983, pretty much the death of the home video game market in America. There was just too much confusion, too many players in the ring, too little oversight and control, and too many subpar video games flooding the market. There wound up being so many unsold Atari games that they rented out a dig site at a landfill and buried over 780,000 unsold games in New Mexico. And unfortunately, that's the legacy of the second generation of consoles. Most of these systems were discontinued in 1984, meaning the 5200 and ColecoVision were only on the market for a measly 2 years. After this, video games went back to being a thing you'd only experience in the arcades and on home computers. Media worldwide reported on this crash, with many saying that video games were a mere fad, a flash in the pan that came and went. Customers were so burned by the mere idea of home gaming that many of these companies would never try to enter the gaming space again. It's a shame, as many of these systems led to some really cool innovations in technology. But for a while, this was the end of home console gaming.
And just like that, as quickly as it came, the dream of console gaming ended. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. It's depressing, but looking back at history is still important, and it can actually be kind of fun. And in fact, this makes me want to look at more things in history to see what other fun things we can find out about.